There's a photograph that exists in 3 different family albums across America. Same pose, same expression, same unsettling eyes staring back through decades of yellowed paper. But these aren't the same man. They're not even related. What they share is something far more disturbing than blood. They share a name that was never really theirs to begin with, a name that was given, a name that was owned. And in the quiet corners of genealogy databases and ancestry records, there's a pattern emerging that most people don't want to acknowledge, because acknowledging it means confronting something we thought we'd buried generations ago. The name is Lord, Thomas Lord, William Lord, James Lord. Pick any county in the American South, any parish in Louisiana, any plantation record from Virginia to Mississippi, and you'll find them, dozens of them, hundreds of them, black families carrying the surname Lord like an inheritance, like a birthright, like something proud. But trace those names backward through census records, through slave schedules, through bills of sale written in careful cursive on cotton paper, and you'll find where they really came from. You'll find the white men who owned them. And then you'll find something worse. You'll find that some of those white lords never really let go. This isn't a story about slavery. We know that story. We've told that story. This is about what happened after. About the lords who stayed, the lords who remained on the same land, in the same towns, watching their former property become their neighbors, their workers, their tenants, and in some cases, something even more complicated. Because when you dig into the family trees, when you follow the genetic trails that DNA testing has only recently made visible, you find that the separation between white lord and black lord wasn't always as clean as the law pretended it was. The blood mixed, the families intertwined, and the secret became the foundation of entire communities. In 1870, there were 23 lord families living within 5 miles of each other in Wilkinson County, Mississippi. 17 of them were black, 6 were white. By 1920, they had grown into a town where everyone knew everyone, where everyone shared history, where the children went to separate schools but walked the same roads their grandparents had walked when some were free and some were not. And nobody talked about it. Nobody acknowledged what everyone knew, that beneath the surface of this quiet southern town was a buried truth that connected them all. The first thing you need to understand about surnames and slavery is that names were never about identity. They were about inventory. When Union soldiers arrived in the South after the war, when they started registering formerly enslaved people for the Freedmen's Bureau, they asked for names, full names, last names. And the newly freed had to choose. Some picked the names of presidents, Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln. Some chose virtues, Freeman, Justice, Strong. But most took the only name they'd ever known themselves by. The name of the man who'd owned them. This wasn't pride. This wasn't loyalty. This was survival in a world that demanded documentation, that required surnames for marriage certificates and land deeds and voter registration. The name was a tool, but it was also a ghost. It carried memory. It carried history that couldn't be spoken aloud, but couldn't be forgotten either. And for the white families who still carried those same names, it created a strange and uncomfortable mirror. Every time they saw that name in a newspaper, on a census form, on a gravestone, they were reminded of what their grandfathers had done. The Lord family of Natchez, Mississippi, had owned one of the largest plantations in the region before the war. 347 people were listed on their property in the 1,860 slave schedule, not by name, by age, by gender, by value. 35-year-old male, prime field hand, $1,000. 12-year-old female, house servant, $600. When freedom came, most of those people stayed, not because they wanted to, because they had nowhere else to go, no money, no education, no family scattered across states they couldn't reach. So they became sharecroppers on the same land they'd worked as slaves, and they kept the name Lord. By 1880, the White Lord family had moved into town. They built a new home on Main Street. They opened a bank. They sent their children to private academies in the north. But every week, on Saturday mornings, black families with the surname Lord would come into that bank to settle their debts. And the White Lord behind the desk would calculate their interest, knowing that some of those faces might carry his father's features, knowing that the woman standing in front of him, holding her hat in corn hands, might be his cousin in ways that the law would never acknowledge. The town knew, everyone knew, but knowing and speaking are two different things. There's a cemetery outside Natchez where both families are buried. The White Lords are on the hill under marble monuments with angels and elaborate engravings. The Black Lords are in the lower field under simple stones, many of them unmarked. Between them runs a dirt path that no one maintains anymore. On one side, inscriptions talk about honor and valor and legacy. On the other side, when there are words at all, they simply say beloved mother, faithful servant, gone home to glory. The dates overlap, the generations mirror each other, born the same years, died the same years. Living parallel lives in the same small town, attending different churches 2 blocks apart, shopping in the same stores at different hours. But the real story isn't in the cemetery. It's in the genetic testing that began appearing in the 21st century, when descendants of both families started sending their DNA to ancestry websites. Something undeniable emerged: shared segments, close matches, percentages that couldn't be explained by distant colonial ancestry. The Black Lord families had significant European DNA, and it wasn't random. It wasn't from scattered origins across the continent. It clustered. It pointed to specific lines, specific surnames, specific families. It pointed to the White Lords. Some of the descendants expected this. They'd heard stories passed down through generations, whispered stories about light, kin children who were never claimed, about plantation owners who visited the quarters after dark, about women who had no power to refuse. But others were shocked. They'd been told their Lord ancestors were proud, were chosen, were free people of color who married into the name. The truth was uglier. The truth was that their great-grandmother had been 15 years old when the master's son first came to her cabin. The truth was that when she gave birth to a child with gray eyes in a family where everyone's eyes were brown, nobody said anything because saying something could get you killed. And for the white descendants who saw these matches appear on their screens, the reaction was complicated. Some wanted to reach out, to acknowledge the connection, to build bridges across a divide that had lasted 150 years. Others were horrified. They denied it. They claimed the algorithms were wrong, that there must be contamination in the samples, that their ancestors would never. But the science doesn't lie, and the records, when you know where to look, tell the same story. Marriage certificates where the father's name is listed as unknown. Birth records where children are clearly mixed race, but no white father is ever named. Wills where white planters left money to specific black families with no explanation for why. In 2003, a woman named Patricia Lord from Chicago submitted her DNA to a genealogy website. She was researching her family tree, trying to trace her roots back beyond her great-grandfather who'd been born in Mississippi in 1875. The results showed what she expected: West African ancestry, a small percentage of European DNA, which was common among African Americans. But then she got a message from someone she'd never heard of, a man named Richard Lord from Tennessee. The website showed them as second cousins, close family, sharing a recent common ancestor. Richard was white. His family had been in Tennessee for generations, but before that, they'd come from Mississippi, from Natchez. He'd been researching his own family tree and had found references to the plantation his ancestors owned. He'd found the slave schedules. He'd seen the names of people his great-great-great-grandfather had bought and sold, and now he was staring at a genetic match that told him one of those people had been more than property, had been family, had given birth to his cousin, separated by race and history but connected by blood. The two of them began corresponding, carefully at first, neither knowing exactly how to address what they'd discovered. Patricia had questions that Richard couldn't answer. Which of his ancestors had been the father? Was it consensual? Was her ancestor a house servant who'd been favored? Or was she a field worker who'd been used and discarded? Richard had his own questions, but he was afraid to ask them, afraid that asking would sound like he was trying to minimize what had happened, afraid that acknowledging it would implicate his own blood in something he couldn't undo. They eventually met in person, in Natchez. They walked through the cemetery together. They stood on opposite sides of that dirt path and looked at the gravestones of people who'd lived in the same world but had never been allowed to acknowledge each other. Patricia found a stone for Sarah Lord, died 1923, age 78. If the dates were right, Sarah would have been born enslaved, would have been 20 years old when the war ended, would have raised her children in freedom, but never escaped the shadow of what had been done to her. Richard found his great-great-grandfather's monument, and for the first time he read the inscription differently. Beloved patriarch, pillar of the community. He wondered if the man had ever thought about the children he'd fathered in the quarters. If he'd ever felt guilt, if he'd ever even considered them his children at all. But here's what makes this story more disturbing than a simple revelation of hidden ancestry. It's not just about the past. It's about what happened in the generations after. Because in some of these towns, the separation between white lord families and black lord families wasn't maintained through law alone. It was maintained through violence, through intimidation, through a silent agreement that certain truths would never be spoken, and anyone who tried to speak them would be silenced. In 1946, a man named James Lord returned to Mississippi after serving in World War II. He was black. He'd been a soldier, had fought in Europe, had seen a world where he wasn't forced to step off the sidewalk when white people approached. He came home changed. He started asking questions about his family history. Started talking to the older generation, the ones who remembered slavery, who remembered the plantation. He wanted to know who his grandfather's father had been. He wanted to know why his grandmother had light skin and blue eyes when everyone else in the family was dark. The White Lord family heard about these questions, and they didn't like them. One of the family members, a man who ran the local hardware store, approached James outside the church one Sunday, told him quietly that some questions were better left unasked. That digging into old history wouldn't help anybody, that there were people in town who wouldn't appreciate a black man claiming kinship with a respected white family. James didn't stop asking. 2 weeks later, his house burned down. The fire department took an hour to respond, even though the station was 10 minutes away. No one was ever charged, no investigation was ever opened, and James Lord left Mississippi and never came back. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you dig deeper, or would you let the past stay buried? This pattern repeated itself across the South. Black families who got too close to claiming their connection to prominent white families found themselves losing jobs, losing homes, losing worse. It wasn't always as dramatic as a fire. Sometimes it was just economic pressure. A loan suddenly called in, a job that disappeared, a landlord who decided not to renew a lease. The message was always the same. You can carry the name, but you can't claim the blood. You can live in the same town, but you can't cross the line. And the line wasn't just about race, it was about power, about who got to control the narrative of history, about who got to decide which ancestors were honored and which were erased. What's remarkable is how long these silences lasted. How many generations carried the knowledge without speaking it? There are elderly black women alive today who remember their grandmothers telling them stories about the white side of the family. Stories told in kitchens late at night when the children were supposed to be asleep. Stories about which white man had come around, about which children looked different, about how you had to be careful who you told because some truths were dangerous. These women grew up knowing they had white cousins living across town, white relatives who would cross the street to avoid them, white family members who would never acknowledge the connection even if you stood face to face. And on the white side, there were similar silences. There are white families today who have old letters hidden in attics, diaries locked in safety deposit boxes, documents that were never supposed to be read. In these papers, you find the truth. You find plantation owners writing about the children born in the quarters who had their eyes or their features. You find wills with strange provisions, leaving money to black families for no stated reason. You find correspondence between family members discussing the problem of mixed-race children and how to handle them, how to acknowledge their existence without claiming them, how to provide for them without legitimizing them. One diary entry from 1889, written by a white Lord family matriarch, describes the funeral of a black woman named Mary Lord. The white woman writes about attending the service, standing in the back of the colored church, watching as Mary was buried. She writes about seeing Mary's daughter, a young woman in her 20s, and being struck by how much she looked like the writer's own deceased brother. And then she writes something chilling. She writes that she wanted to approach the girl, to tell her who her father had been, to offer her some connection to the family she'd never known, but she didn't, because it would have caused a scandal, because it would have disrupted the social order, because it was better to let the girl live in ignorance than to admit the truth. That girl never knew. She died in 1954, never knowing that her father had been a white plantation owner, that she had half siblings living in the mansion on the hill, that she was entitled to an inheritance that she never received. Her children didn't know, her grandchildren didn't know. It wasn't until her great-granddaughter took a DNA test in 2015 that the connection was finally proven, and by then, everyone who could have told the story was dead. All that remained were the genetic markers and the silent knowledge that had been passed down through whispers and warnings and carefully worded family stories that never quite named what everyone understood. Today, there are hundreds of Lord families across America, black and white. Some of them know about the connection, most don't. They live in different neighborhoods, work different jobs, attend different churches, vote for different politicians. They have nothing in common except a name and a history that nobody taught them in school, but the DNA doesn't care about what you were taught. The DNA tells the truth that the census records tried to hide, that the Jim Crow laws tried to enforce, that generations of silence tried to bury. And here's what we're left with, not a simple story of slavery and freedom, not a clean narrative of oppression and liberation, but something more complicated and more human and more uncomfortable. We're left with families that are connected by blood and separated by everything else. We're left with descendants who carry the same genetic markers, but can't agree on what their shared history means. We're left with white families who have to confront the fact that their ancestors weren't just slaveholders, but were rapists, men who used their power to take what they wanted from women who had no power to refuse. And we're left with black families who have to decide whether to claim that connection or reject it, whether to seek out their white relatives or let the separation stand. Some have chosen connection. There are Lord family reunions now that include both sides, gatherings where descendants meet and try to build something new from the ruins of what was. They exchange stories, compare photographs, try to piece together the full family tree that was deliberately fragmented. It's awkward, it's painful. There are conversations about reparations, about inherited wealth, about who benefited from slavery and who suffered from it. There are arguments about whether the white descendants bear any responsibility for what their ancestors did. There are tears and anger and moments of unexpected grace. But most haven't chosen connection. Most have decided that the past is the past, that opening those wounds won't heal anything, that some doors are better left closed. And maybe they're right. Maybe there's no way to reconcile what happened. Maybe the best you can do is acknowledge that it happened, that it shaped everything that came after, that the consequences are still playing out in wealth gaps and education gaps and health gaps that follow racial lines that were drawn on plantation ledgers 200 years ago. The lords, who shared more than just a name, are all of us. We're the inheritors of a history that we didn't create but can't escape. We're the descendants of people who hurt each other and loved each other and used each other and saved each other, often all at once, often in ways that defied the categories that the law tried to impose. And the question isn't whether we can fix what they broke. The question is whether we can look at what they left us without flinching, whether we can stand in that cemetery, on either side of that dirt path, and acknowledge that the separation was always a lie, that the families were always connected, that the blood always knew what the culture tried to deny. The photograph still exists in 3 different family albums, same pose, same expression, same eyes. And now we know why.